Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we dig into the sources you're looking at and, well, pull out the really interesting stuff, the things that make you go, aha, but without you having to wade through everything.
Basically, your shortcut to getting up to speed.
Exactly. And this time, you've pointed us towards something fascinating. Montgomery Schuyler's American Architecture. It's from 1892.
Yeah, it's a real window into how people were thinking about buildings back then, right? During a huge period of change in America.
And Schuyler gets specific. He's not just talking general ideas, though he does that too, like with the Queen Anne style.
Uh-huh.
But he also looks really closely at actual buildings. The Vanderbilt houses, the Brooklyn Bridge, even a cathedral planned for Albany that never actually got built.
And he heads west, too.
Hmm.
Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, seeing what was happening there.
So our mission here for you is to pull out Schuyler's sharpest insights, the big arguments that were shaping architecture back then.
We want to give you those surprising bits, the stuff that really stands out, but make it quick and, well, engaging.
Okay, let's jump in. Schuyler kicks things off with a pretty bold statement. He says the real radical defect of architecture in his time.
And we're talking late 1800s here.
Right. The defect is that architects stopped being builders.
That's a huge claim. And he gives it historical context, doesn't he?
He does. He says, look, before the Renaissance, well, except maybe in classical Rome, architects were builders. They understood materials, construction from the ground up.
They have that hands-on knowledge.
Exactly. Then comes the Renaissance, and things change. Schuyler sees artists, painters, sculptors, goldsmiths, even starting to design buildings.
Talented artists, no doubt, but maybe lacking that deep practical construction sense.
That seems to be his point. And they leaned heavily on Greek and Roman styles.
So what's the problem with that, according to Schuyler?
Well, he felt their designs weren't always connected to the facts of construction, how things are actually built.
Unlike older styles.
Yeah, he contrasts it with Greek and Gothic architecture. He saw those as growing out of the way they were built. There was a kind of truth there, he thought.
Form-following function, almost literally.
Right. And he's hoping for a return to that. A sensible, practical adherence to the facts of construction. Sounds quite down to earth, doesn't it?
It does. And this ties into his views on specific styles, like Queen Anne, which was big at the time.
Oh, yeah, the Queen Anne revival. Norman Shaw was a key figure. Schuyler describes it as trying to mix free composition with classic detail.
So those asymmetrical houses, bay windows, maybe some columns or pediments borrowed from classical style.
Exactly. But Schuyler's like, hang on, can this really work? Or is it just a mechanical mixture?
Just sticking things together that don't naturally fit.
That's his concern. He argues that real classical details grew out of simple classical ways of building. You can't just, slap them onto a modern building designed for modern needs and expect it to feel authentic.
Right. It doesn't emerge organically from the structure itself.
He gets quite pointed about it. He criticizes these free classic buildings where the classical bits are just applied to the outside. Like his phrase is waterproof paper on the outer walls.
Ouch. Like decoration with no real meaning.
Precisely. He uses one of the W.H. Vanderbilt houses as an example, calls it Greek Renaissance, but points out it uses Roman details in ways that, to him, just didn't make structural sense.
So it looked grand, but the architectural language was kind of jumbled.
Yeah, or at least not logically applied from his perspective. He contrasts it with a simpler brownstone, where the carving felt more thought out, more premeditated.
So for Schuyler, the big mistake, the radical error of Queen Anne, is trying to force classical details onto modern designs.
Mm-hmm. Unlike Gothic ornament, which he saw as growing naturally from Gothic construction, it wasn't just added on later.
It makes sense from his perspective. You can see the internal logic he's aiming for.
And then he touches on something else happening at the time, this call for a uniquely American architecture.
Ah, yes, the search for a national style.
You can almost hear him sighing. He mentions Walt Whitman. Even this idea someone had apparently seriously of using a log cabin as the model for a town hall.
Wow, okay. So Schuyler wasn't impressed with that approach.
Not really. He saw it as a bit, provincial. He felt this desperate need for originality just led to stuff that was different, sure, but not necessarily good, just weird.
Different for difference's sake.
Exactly. And he worried about young American architects. He thought they were jumping ahead, trying to use the fancy bits, the refinements of established European styles.
Instead of starting with the basics.
Right. Instead of embracing the, quote, rudenesses of a living and growing architecture, like they were trying to write poetry before they knew grammar.
That's a great analogy. analogy. He wanted something to grow organically from American conditions, American ways of building, not just copying or mixing styles awkwardly.
So, okay, theory is one thing. How does he see this playing out in real buildings? He gives us some New York examples, starting with those famous Vanderbilt houses. Symbols of the Gilded Age, right?
Definitely symbols of wealth and ambition. So what's his take?
Well, he looks at W.K. Vanderbilt's place, designed by Richard Morris Hunt. He admits it has power, massiveness, and he actually likes how the ornament works with the structure there.
Okay, so some positive points.
But he thinks the roof is a mess. Huddled, he calls it. Says it tries to cram in too many styles, like late Gothic and early Renaissance, all at once.
They're trying too hard.
Seems like it. And he talks about this pyramidization, the way the building's mass seems to build up towards the corners.
Interesting observation. What about the other Vanderbilt houses?
Cornelius Vanderbilt's house, by George B. Post. He notes the fancy stone front, but wonders if there's maybe too much brick elsewhere. He's not keen on the brackets or the turret.
So, less successful in his eyes.
Overall, yeah. He sees careful work in the details, but feels they don't add up because the main design isn't strong enough. Still, he grudgingly calls it an ornament to the city.
A backhanded compliment, maybe.
A bit. But then he gets to W.H. Vanderbilt's houses, and he really lets loose. Calls them boxes of brown stone with architecture applique.
Applique, like sewing patches onto fabric.
Exactly. He sees those classical details as just stuck on, crude, with no real structural logic. It perfectly illustrates his main beef, architecture just being surface decoration.
It really brings his earlier points home. Okay, moving from private mansions to a massive public work. The Brooklyn Bridge.
Ah, the bridge. He sees it as a major monument, something that will last. He even wonders what future archaeologists will make of it, and us.
That's a big thought. And he contrasts the engineer's view with the architect's view, right, using people like Ferguson and Ruskin.
Yeah, discussing whether architectural features need to be strictly necessary. It's clear Schuyler is wrestling with this himself.
And his core idea comes back again.
Absolutely. In great architecture, like the Gothic cathedrals he admired, the way it's built and the way it looks are, for him, inseparable.
One and the same.
He uses the simple image, a rope over a forked tree, to explain the bridge's basic idea. But then he criticizes the big stone towers.
What's wrong with the towers? They seem pretty iconic now.
To Schuyler, they didn't express their function clearly enough. He felt the flat tops hid the engineering marvel inside, and not like, say, Amiens Cathedral, where the structure is right there visually.
Interesting. He wanted the architecture to reveal the engineering.
Seems so. And the anchorages where the cables are secured, he says they're scientifically fine, but artistically, like a boulder rolled upon a rope.
Not exactly elegant.
Nope. And he slams the ironwork details as shabby and the design of the iron stations as grossly illiterate. He felt these things really dragged down the whole project.
So, a lot of criticism there. Anything he liked.
He did praise the main span, the roadway sweeping upward, and he saw the bridge as a potential lesson for architects. Obey the function of an organism.
So, admire the engineering, respect its logic, but disappointed by the architectural execution in parts.
That sums it up well. Okay, next up. A project that didn't get built. H. Richardson's design for a cathedral in Albany, New York.
Richardson, a huge name in American architecture then. Romanesque style, usually.
Right, and Schuyler thought this unbuilt design was important, said it influenced later plans for the big cathedral in New York City.
What did he like about it?
He liked Richardson's focus on the big picture, the all-importance of the relation of its masses, how the main shapes work together.
But Richardson's Romanesque style, did Schuyler see issues there for a cathedral?
He did. He pointed out that Romanesque isn't ideal for creating those really high, soaring, vaulted ceilings you often associate with cathedrals. The groined vaults used in Romanesque are strong, but they don't quite get that same lightness as Gothic vaults.
What are the details, like the chapels around the end?
The apsidal chapels. Schuyler thought they looked good, striking even, but felt they were kind of forced onto the interior plan rather than growing out of it naturally.
Okay, so not quite organic in the way he valued.
And he felt Richardson was trying to get the effect of a French Gothic chevet, that rounded east end, but without using the actual Gothic structure, like flying buttresses, which are needed to support those high vaults.
So, mimicking the look without the underlying structural logic.
That seems to be the critique. But overall, Schuyler still saw it as a really suggestive design. It showed, he thought, that a strong architect could put their personal stamp on any style they adopted.
So, flawed perhaps, but still valuable and influential.
Exactly. Okay, let's head west now, as Schuyler did. Chicago first, rebuilding after the Great Fire.
A chance to build bigger, more modern structures.
Definitely. Though Schuyler notes the older architects maybe weren't quite ready for the new tall metal-framed buildings. And they had challenges, like the unstable soil needing those floating foundations.
Right. What did he make of the architecture itself?
He wasn't seeing many great churches, surprisingly. Thought the secular public buildings were more important architecturally.
Like what?
Well, he disliked the city and county building, called its style Ludovican, too ornate. And the Board of Trade, he said it had no style, just a kind of eclectic Gothic. Doesn't sound like high praise.
Not exactly glowing reviews. Anything he did like.
Yes, the Art Institute got praised for being clearly organized and harmonious. The auditorium building was mixed. He liked the strong base, but felt the outside didn't fully show what was inside, like the actual auditorium space.
Okay. And commercial buildings.
Interestingly, he thought Chicago's commercial architecture might be the most authentically American stuff he saw there, because it was so focused on its purpose.
Business.
Function-deriving form again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He highlights Richardson's Field building as a good example, Victorian Gothic, but straightforward with its linteled windows. He liked the Owings building, too, for showing its structure clearly, avoiding being boring or overly fussy.
So clarity and honesty were key for him there.
But he also called out buildings like the Studebaker, saying its piers looked too thin and the design just kind of stopped above the ground floor arcade.
Ah. What about houses in Chicago?
He thought they tried harder to look like actual homes, maybe less showy than back east. Richardson's influence was everywhere, but often just superficially. He joked about Janua Richardsoniensis, like every other doorway was trying to be Richardsonian.
Huh. A bit derivative.
Yeah. And he even thought Richardson's own houses in Chicago weren't great examples, finding flaws in their design logic, like openings that seemed random and weakened the building's solid look.
So even the master wasn't perfect in his view. Okay, from Chicago to the Twin Cities.
St. Paul in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
He starts by quoting Trollope about the contrast between nature and man's work along the Mississippi. Notes Minneapolis growing super fast, St. Paul more slowly, and this rivalry showing up in how tall their buildings were.
Trying to outdo each other? What about specific buildings there?
He was pretty harsh on the Minneapolis government building, ill-assorted features, no real style, just Western in name. And St. Paul's City Hall and Courthouse, unfortunate.
Oof, you didn't mince words.
Not at all. He saw Richardson's influence again in the Minneapolis Public Library, but modified. Churches, he thought, tended to stick closer to traditional styles out west.
What about hotels or offices?
The West Hotel in Minneapolis seemed more substantial to him than St. Paul's Big Hotel. He thought it had a recognizable character, even if it mixed styles.
An eclectic physiognomy.
Right. He mentions the rivalry between architects in the two cities. Saw Chicago architect Root's influence in the lumber exchange in Minneapolis.
Any standouts in St. Paul?
Yes, the Pioneer Press building got high marks for sticking strictly to its utilitarian needs and achieving an impressive result because of it. Also, the Bank of Minnesota for its quaintness and gables, and the Endicott Arcade as a kind of subtle design compared to showier stuff in Minneapolis, like the Guarantee Loan building.
So appreciating restraint sometimes.
Definitely. And he compares the New York Life buildings in both cities, preferring the Minneapolis one. For houses, he really liked St. Paul's Summit Avenue, tasteful, well-funded, varied styles, not really any bad buildings.
Sounds like a successful residential area, in his view.
It does. So the big question he asks is there really a distinct Western architecture? Or is it just architecture happening in the West?
Influenced by the East, but dealing with new conditions, new material.
Exactly. And these new factors were leading to buildings that didn't quite fit the old historical styles, which he saw as potentially good in emancipation, he called it.
But potentially risky, too.
Yeah, if you throw out the old rules, you need skill and self-restraint. But he ends on a hopeful note about the West. He thinks some of these emancipated practitioners might actually be the ones to forge a truly national style.
Interesting. Breaking free might lead to something genuinely new and American.
That seems to be his hope. So, wrapping this up for you, our learner, the big takeaway has to be that the late 19th century was just buzzing with architectural debate, right?
Absolutely. Wrestling with history, new technology, and this whole question of what American architecture should even be.
And a detail that really sticks out is Schuyler's critique of just sticking classical bits onto buildings like wallpaper. That sense of, well, architectural integrity being lost.
Yeah, or that tension he saw on the Brooklyn Bridge between the raw engineering power and the, let's say, sometimes awkward attempts at artistic expression on top of it.
And seeing those regional variations starting to show up, Chicago's business-like approach versus what was happening in St. Paul and Minneapolis.
hmm Which leads us to a final thought for you to chew on. Thinking about Schuyler's time, over a century ago, what do you think makes architecture American today?
Yeah, and that gap he worried about between the architect as a designer and the architect as a builder, has that changed? Do we still see that tension?
And are we still trying to find that sweet spot between pure function, being honest about how things are built, and creating something with real artistic meaning? Maybe look around your own town or city with Schuyler's critiques in mind. What do you see?